Even now, when the plot calls for me to turn to stone, the sun intervenes. Some mornings in summer, I step outside and the sky opens and pours itself into me, as if I were a saint about to die. The plot calls for me to live, be ordinary, say nothing to anyone. Inside the house, the mirrors burn when I pass. Hello, and welcome to Words That Burn, the podcast taking a closer look at poetry. This week's poem is There Are Mornings by Liesl Mueller. At the core of this poem, full of vaguely threatened endings, is a burning ember of hope. I read this poem last week and immediately felt a warming sensation from it. This sensation, I believe, lies not only in Liesl Mueller's gift for flowing and layered imagery, but also in the quiet assurance that comes from its message. Things will continue. So sure was the message emanating from the poem that I knew I had to feature it on the podcast, and that I'd have to learn more about Mueller herself. The more I learned about this week's poet, the more I understood where that message of undying hope came from. Liesl Mueller was an American-German poet born in Germany in 1924. From that year alone, many of you may already realize how Mueller and her family found their way to the United States. The daughter of two teachers, Fritz and Ilse Mueller, the family was forced to flee Germany with the rise of the Nazi Party in the 30s. This was directly related to her father's vehement anti-fascist views, which meant the country was no longer safe for him and his family. Her father left first in 1937. Lisel, her sister and mother, followed on 2 years later. In this way, she found her way to America at the age of 15. One might think that the trauma of such an exodus from her home country might be the beginning of her poetic journey. But in actual fact, she would not find writing until much later in her 30s, when her mother passed away. Before we continue, I have a favour to ask. If you've been enjoying this episode so far, or if you've been a fan of the podcast for a while, please consider leaving me a review on whatever platform you listen on. It really helps to get the show out to more people. With that in mind, let's get on with the show. The death of her mother would unlock her poetic voice. She began her writing journey with a poem that focused on her own beginnings and immense grief, titled When I Am Asked. This poem opened with the stanza, "When I am asked how I began writing poems, I talk about the indifference of nature." She goes on to speak about the way in which nature refused to mark her mother's passing in any way, leaving her with monumental personal grief, something she could only carry internally. She ends the poem with the closing lines, "Placed my grief in the mouth of language, the only thing that would grieve with me." There is a juxtaposition here between the internal and the external, the private inner life and the public outer one. This was a driving force behind much of Mueller's work, particularly the way in which private lives are often at the mercy of public events. She stated to a newspaper after winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1997 that, "Poetry for me is the answer to how does one stay sane when private lives are being ransacked by public events." No doubt her thoughts on this were shaped by the trauma of the circumstances of her arrival in the United States. It would leave an indelible mark on the poet, and her response to the tragedy of the everyday and the turmoil of her own inner life was one of tenacity and perseverance. It is that resilience and need to continue that flows through this poem, There Are Mornings. This poem bears all the hallmarks of Liesl Mueller's work. Each reference calls out to mythology and folklore, perhaps the richest vein that the poet tapped in her writing. as critic and author Judith Kitchen wrote for the Dictionary of Literary Biography. Mueller was able to mine the traditional stories for metaphor. In fact, metaphor becomes the second language in this book. She examines fairy tales to see what can be applied to contemporary life. In the process, contemporary life is also examined as the source of new legends. The domestic provides a context in which to test the larger implications of myth. While Kitchen is talking about a very particular collection of Mueller's here, The Need to Hold Still from 1980. However, the point of the domestic being the perfect soil to examine and apply the grander drama of myth is present in all of Mueller's work. In There Are Mornings, the mythological references embellish the inner turmoil of our speaker. This embellishment turns an average day with its typical hardships into a Greek tragedy, and beyond that, a biblical one. Before we dive into the poem itself, I'd like to make a quick observation about how I've split the poem for analysis this week. It is split into two sections, based on one of the poem's only two full stops. It rests midway on the 8th line and acts as a great exhale. This is in stark contrast to the first full stop we encounter, which feels more like a desperate inhale, a gasping attempt to catch breath. As we'll discover, this fits quite well with the dire tone of the events being described in the first section. Mueller was renowned for the rhythmic balance of her poetry. This was born of her own fascination with language. She once wrote, "I am especially intrigued by the formal tone of the language. It almost has the effect of a Shakespearean monologue, yet it is certainly grounded in the contemporary world." These beautifully intricate, rhythmic words would become a trademark characteristic of any poem written by Mueller. Her attention to language and the way in which she used it in her writing was incredibly intentional and paved the way for a swathe of awards that she would win in her lifetime. It seemed only natural then to pay attention to those deliberately placed full stops and have them guide how we split the poem. The first section is a masterclass in how to weave mythology and folklore through the ordinary everyday. Even now, when the plot calls for me to turn to stone, the sun intervenes. Some mornings in summer, I step outside and the sky opens and pours itself into me, as if I were a saint about to die. The poem opens with one of humanity's oldest mythological tropes, petrification, the turning of living beings into stone. The most famous example of which might be Medusa from Greek mythology. She was a gorgon, a monstrous creature cursed for her beauty and vanity, capable of turning those who looked at her into stone. Though Medusa is arguably the most famous example of this trope, we've seen this across countless cultures. In response to why this might be, scholar Amos Brown stated, "Fossils are to be found all over the world, a clear evidence to human beings from earliest times that living beings can indeed turn into stone." Previous to the modern scientific accounts of how fossils are formed, the idea of magicians or gods turning living creatures into stone seemed completely plausible in terms of these cultures. No matter its origin or its cause, petrification is almost universally recognized as a punishment in story. Our speaker in this poem clearly feels that this may be the fate they deserve. However, that first image of warm hope makes its appearance as the sun intervenes. This intervention, coupled with the poem's opening words, "even now," hints at the fact that our speaker may be at their lowest point, their nadir. As we read these lines, this first section, we feel that the weight of the world rests on them. The imagery of sunlight continues when the speaker begins to speak of summer mornings, moments of hope that are sadly dashed when the next image of skies opening is introduced and a rather harrowing thought of entire clouds pouring themselves into a being, drowning them internally, is introduced. Our speaker states, "The sky opens and pours itself into me." This is a powerful image, and as I said, invokes the notion of drowning. Importantly, when we look at Mueller's work, it is drowning internally. Once again, she is balancing between the external public life she leads and the inner turmoil she must experience and carry alone. The scene that Mueller sets here, that of saints and parting clouds, are descriptions we often see associated with medieval and Renaissance paintings of Christian saints. Miraculous acts and divine punishments were often depicted using beams of light and open sky, with clouds parting ways to paint holy figures in a glow, signifying their divine or soon-to-be divine status. Given Mueller's love of reworking stories that have women at the centre of them, often in the role of tragic figures, I think an educated guess on the identity of the saint being referenced here would be Joan of Arc, or Jeanne d'Arc. Joan of Arc is a wonderfully polarised symbol from both history and myth, an almost perfect storm of both. She was canonised by the Roman Catholic Church in 1920, despite being executed as a heretic in 1431. A heroine of the 100 Years' War and now a patron saint of France. She feels particularly suited to Mueller's own interpretive style of poetry, as at different points she became a nationalist symbol for the far-right movement in France, then later became a feminist icon, particularly in the United States. Despite this multitude of interpretations to her story, there is a true line. Joan of Arc is a symbol of suffering. At this stage, in this poem, I feel it's important to note that the world keeps intervening in our speaker's misery. The threat of petrification and persecution are washed away by warm lights and glowing seasons. There is a beautiful sense of subtle, warm hope thrumming under each line. Images like mornings and summer only insist upon this. They are a reminder that no matter how low things get, there are still glimmers of hope. With this in mind, it's interesting to see how the speaker talks about the plot as if it is some kind of deity in itself. How it calls for her to do something. An immovable, commanding force that strips them of their agency, and yet intervenes at the point of no return. These beautiful, almost beguiling types of paradox are another testament to the layered and intricate way in which Mueller crafted her verse to draw us, the audience, in. Paradox continues to contradict itself in the next section. But the plot calls for me to live. Be ordinary. Say nothing to anyone. Inside the house, the mirrors burn when I pass. As I've previously stated, the full stop that precedes the beginning of this section acts as a huge exhalation of breath, both for our speaker and the reader. Then, that hope so gently hinted at in the first section is given room to bloom and find purchase. The enemy that was the plot has changed its tune, and now demands our speaker live. More than that, it calls for the speaker to endure in the most average of ways. Be ordinary, say nothing. Here, I have to admit, my concrete understanding of the poem splits. I am in two minds as to what is being stated here by the poet. On the one hand, I feel that this newfound, almost demanded resilience from the speaker is an affirmation that life goes on. It echoes one of the primary themes of Mueller's poetry, powering through inner turmoil. Given her early years and having been forced to flee Germany with her family, it's not hard to see why the poet would have focused on a way to keep going no matter what. The ending lines of burning mirrors and a woman passing by paints a picture of grace under fire. For me, it is easily the most striking image of the entire poem. It shows that while not always glamorous, surviving is better than succumbing. On the other hand, there is a slightly grimmer interpretation that can be applied to this second section. This darker reading also illuminates the meaning behind the burning mirrors of the last lines a little better. Plot is consistently the speaker's enemy in this verse. The first section outlines biblical and mythical tribulation. The second section, to my mind, depicts a woman who cannot rest, one who is called to live, a woman who cannot cry out or seek help. She must be ordinary, must say nothing. The burning mirrors as she passes are, unsurprisingly, another mythological reference in this reading. It's said that in the year 212 BC, the famous mathematician Archimedes was living in Syracuse. Unfortunately for the people of Syracuse, Rome had turned its conqueror's eye on the city, and the might of its fleet was sailing to lay waste to all within its walls. This did not sit well with our hero mathematician, and he turned, as he so often did, to physics to solve this new problem. As the people of Syracuse called him mad, he wheeled a huge burnished mirror to the edge of a cliff, or several large burnished mirrors, depending on who's telling the story. He began to calculate the angles of the mirror, and with the aid of the sun, he created fiery beams of destruction, which he then pointed directly towards the Romans. As anything made entirely of wood might be, the ships were decimated, and Syracuse stood a while longer. So the burning mirrors of There Are Mornings might just be the perfect symbol for the torment our speaker feels. It is an analogy for destruction and the waste she sees about her in her own life, or as she puts it, inside the house. I'm honestly a little torn on which interpretation is correct. However, I do love the notion of eternal resilience in the face of insurmountable odds, and so it's the burning embers of hope and the first interpretation that I choose to cling to. Which interpretation do you favour? I would love to hear. Regardless of the layers of meaning that make it up, There Are Mornings is a remarkably brief but potent series of images that are a testament not only to Liesl Mueller's abilities as a poet, but to her staunch belief in the need to endure. It is a reminder to us that even when gods and monsters are at our gates, we can still do our best to endure. Not to thrive, not to flourish, but to endure. As always, this is my interpretation, but I'd love to hear yours. If you'd like to get in touch with me, there are a few ways to do so. You can reach me directly by email at wordsthatburnpodcast@gmail.com. You can get in touch through the podcast website, www.wordsthatburnpodcast.com, or www.wordsthatburnpodcast.acast.com. I'm on Twitter or X at WordsThatBurn. I'm on Instagram at WordsThatBurnPodcast and TikTok at WordsThatBurn2. If you'd like to read the script for this week's podcast, complete with citations and sources, feel free to check out the Substack link below in the description. As I said earlier on, if you enjoyed this episode, or if you've been enjoying the podcast for a while, please consider leaving me a review wherever you listen. It would be fantastic and help the podcast out a lot. Even better, if you know someone who might enjoy this episode, please consider sending it to them directly so they can listen to it too. If you have any poems or poets that you would like to hear covered on this podcast, please get in touch with me as well. I'm always eager to have suggestions. Words That Burn is written and produced by me, Benjamin Colopy.